Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. And today I'm covering with Connor from the Celtic Templar the history of the Irish military, in particular the weapons and the outfits and the armour that they would have worn between the period of the Golden Age of Ireland. That is the year 550 all the way over to 793, where Ireland is in this kind of insular and golden age that it's having going on between the saints and the scholars, where the Roman Empire itself around 490 has collapsed. Well, to a certain degree, there is now many scholars out there that are kind of arguing that it was more of a transition period. But regardless, we're now at a point where Ireland is kind of isolated by itself, and that Ireland has now become the beaker of intelligence in the Western world. And there, from that point onwards, Ireland starts to develop its own form of literature in its own realm. And you very good examples of that today is obviously the likes of the Book of Kells, the Book of Armagh, and various other annals that are written at this period that really highlight the peak of the literature that is going on in Ireland at the time. However, at the same time, between this period of 550 to 793, Ireland also starts to develop its own form of warfare that's going on. For a very long time, Ireland was involved with this sort of conventional warfare against the Romans, but also this warfare that involved a lot of raiding into Roman settlements, stealing a lot of Roman people and bringing them back to Ireland. However, with the fall of the Roman Empire, this is starting to kind of ease down, and Ireland is starting to settle into more of this kind of cattle raiding society. And we can see that with the amount of ring forts that are starting to appear left, right, and centre around the island of Ireland, where Ireland starts producing thousands and thousands of these kind of farmstead ring forts left, right, and centre throughout the island of Ireland. So it's definitely a very interesting time in Ireland at the time. And Connor, I can see your outfit completely kind of reflects what's happening in Ireland at the time, even from your classic quarter-length pants that I can see in the Book of Kells and in Gerald of Wales's book as well. When he was in Ireland, could you tell me? We'll probably start with the top, actually, with your helmet, because I find your helmet quite fascinating. What's your helmet?
Yes, this style of helmet is mostly of the late Roman style. This is a Sprangen helm model, but this style, as we can understand from the late Roman military units, they would have used this, especially in Britannia.
Mm.
And what we can understand, these styles of helmets were hugely seen in Britannia, mainly by military units all throughout there. And there are different designs and different variations, and which the Irish even copied and used them. In fact, we also have accounts even used by the Picts. They copied from the Romans and designed their own version. So it wouldn't have been too unbelievable to actually see Irish doing probably the same thing. In fact, the kingdom of Dalriada, for example, when it established its own kingdom in the western shores of Scotland, there have been some of them that were uncovered who have actually had these own designs. And as well, many historians believe that a lot of these helmets were taken in raids by the Irish, and it wouldn't be unbelievable. This, though, is just a regular foot soldier model, or cavalier model. However, some of them were even embroidered with jewelry and golden crests. In fact, one example of these helmets we can understand was even worn by the prince of the High King of Ireland, who of which fought during the Battle of Clontarf, of which was Brian Boru's son. It stated that he wore such a helmet when he fought against the Vikings, though we don't know what it actually looked like. All that it said was golden crested design with beautiful gems.
Yeah. I was thinking that as well, because when we go into the economic golden age of Ireland, and also, but we don't even have to go that far. Like the Anglo Saxons, who allegedly, and this is going to start a lot of arguments, obviously in the comments section. But there's some people out there that would argue that it's a dark age or it's a part of the late antiquity of England, etc., etc. But even in England at the time, you have a lot of patterns and designs in the helmets that we can find with the Anglo-Saxons. So it makes sense that with the Irish, that you would also find Ireland, which is supposed to be in the golden age of Ireland, and we can find as well finds and artifacts. We can find lots of designs. So if we have finds which are metalwork with these really decorative designs, it doesn't really take much to do the same with the helmets.
Exactly. One major example, especially, is one style of helmet that is identical to this, of which, if I actually hold this up, it reminds me of one particular helmet that was used by the Anglo-Saxons, and that would be the Sutton Hoo helmet, which is beautifully designed and based off of this style of helmet, although it is based off of a cavalier helmet since it has a faceplate. This one doesn't. This is probably just used by cavalry and such, but still, this would be pretty much the same type of design into its own form. And we can see that especially with the Irish. Now, though, not just this design, but also models like this design would be used. And these styles would even have plumes of horsehair or even that of fabric to indicate of a nobleman on the battlefield, to show off, to say, hey, here I am, come towards me. And it's kind of like a rallying cry, like, hey, if we're broken up on the battlefield, come to me, especially because one, they would have had plan or colorations of their family house, so this would indicate of where they are. Now, though, this one have the neck guard, and this is pretty much indicating to the fact that one, a lot of them start to remove this because it's like kind of like, for example, saying that why do we need this extra metal to the back of my neck to begin with? I could just then look a little more easily, in which we can understand why. But yes, this would have also been decorated and such sometimes. Some even had incorporation of early Irish writing of what we can understand, stating of their name, such as their family crest name and such, or warrior, or the spirit animal, or even Christ. Even because one helmet was even had in Old Irish having the letters of Christ on his front end of his helmet, indicating that God is watching me. So it's kind of like a show of faith, if you would.
Where'd you get that source that they're writing inside the helmets and stuff?
This actually comes from the from this book right here of the Arthur and the Anglo-Saxon Wars, and this book does actually show a few examples, though we don't there's only like one example, but it does give a good example to that. But it does indicate of other historical accounts of this also written, especially in the Chronicles of Ireland. We also get that also written down. However, more and more over the centuries, it starts to fade from historical aspects. Most people believe probably because there's like no point in it that's just decorated, or just here you go, son. Here's my helmet.
Yeah.
Centuries, yeah. But the more common helmet, mainly that is common, would have been a bow-like helmet like this. And this would have been used by the lower ranks of warrior troops or even the levy troops. And this sometimes these would have had cheek plates. This one doesn't, but still, this would have been a good helmet for any everyday warrior, especially seeing the fact that one, hey, this is cheap and effective. I can easily afford this. Let me just go with this for right now until my next raiding session, especially, or cattle raiding and such. But still, this would be a really good helmet, especially to stop a certain blow from a weapon. However, over the years, this would be, by the late centuries, this would be slightly more common, especially as they start to protrude nasal guards and as well cheek plates a little bit more, rather than the more, part of the design model, as this would be passed down from father to son. This would be like, well, I'm a blacksmith, I'm just going to make this. So that way it'll be a lot.
Yeah, I
Because
definitely agree.
because the second born son would have to buy his own helmet, while the firstborn be able to get this style of helmet that would have been passed down from father to son. So yeah, that's the way we can understand it.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And I notice as well that you have riveted mail on. Going into the cattle raiding periods, is riveted mail, could you find any source to back up the fact that they're still wearing riveted mail between 550 to 793? Or because they're getting more involved with cattle raiding where they have to be quicker and faster, is there less riveted mail? Or but at the same time, I suppose they're involved with
Yeah.
the fighting that's happening in Pickland and Wales. So maybe they still have a massive usage for riveted mail.
There actually are many accounts, especially from the writings of Cullum Kill, who actually wrote it, which Cullum Kill, if none of y'all know who this is, that if y'all want to use the common term, his name is Saint Columba, which is both the patron saint of Ireland and Scotland, and in such we actually get from his writings, and he states that they wore riveted mail, especially in the more wealthier areas in Ireland, such as along the eastern coasts of Ireland, being the most biggest example. And this is probably because of raiding sessions in those type of regions. And now, though, the further west you would go, the less likely you would have seen mail, unless it was one worn by the higher up chieftains and such. But a warrior, he could actually afford this. This could have been also one if he, depending on how much money he got in a raid and such, he could have probably afford this. He could even afford certain other equipments and armor. But it depended on the region they were in, as most probably had to, one, either had to go for cattle raiding, which, yeah, you could get money out of that, or get more money by raiding across the sea, as this would have been the more common idea, especially if you went to Britannia or Anglo-Saxon, or as well some accounts, even as far as the region of the Franks. But this one was rare, to say the least.
Yeah, because it would take, like we do have with Nile 9 hostages and stuff, we do have sources of them allegedly claiming to go as far as the north of France, Gaul at the time, raiding amongst what was, collapsing at the time, the Roman Empire, and then obviously the arrival of the Franks and stuff. So it is interesting that they do, the Irish, even later on, let's say the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, when they're looking back at this period, they are documenting at the fact that they are raiding into those areas and stuff. So yeah, I do believe that although rare, that they were raiding into the north of France. And of course, they had very, very good relations with the Brittany as well, in the north of France as well. So I could imagine in that kind of Celtic area that it would have been easy for them to hop over to their neighbours in those areas, and then from there obviously pop over to the Frankish areas as well, raiding and trading, etc., etc. So it makes sense to me, to be honest with you.
Other than mail, there would be scale armor. Now, this was very expensive and mostly probably only reserved for the most noble, for the most higher ups, such as the High Kings of Ireland. And what we can understand from some historical textbooks, or some historical texts written by later Irish monks, who stated on, even by the late Golden Age of Ireland, especially by the 8th or 7th century, most of the scale armor started to look more and more like this, a lot bigger scale pieces, rather than the more Roman look. But during the earlier period, this would have probably been what it mostly looked more Roman-like, but during the later period, looked probably more like this, a junky copy of the fancy original.
Ah, so there is change and adapting to it. That's interesting, all right. And so the original scale armor would have been far tougher than the updated version.
Exactly, because the original version of Roman style scale armor, this did have a form of padding underneath to take the shock and blow, but as well was instead of like with this one has the links interconnected with small metal rings,
Hmm.
and this would have been painstakingly put together for months and months, probably even a full year sometimes indicated, but it depended. Now, what we can understand from historical texts, even from the Picts were also known to have done the same thing. And there have been some discoveries of certain armor that has been discovered in the region of Pictland of surviving pieces. However, it depends on whether or not how they were connected. Some accounts stated that these were all interconnected with some form of leather or cloth or woolen cloth, like yarn or something like that, would be the best option because it would be a lot more easy to replace. However, what it was as a liner is left unknown. Some historians state it might have been leather, others state it might have been a woolen coat, others say something else. So we don't know of what material it could have been, but by the later centuries, this would have been a lot more common to see, and it would have been a lot more heavier to wear compared to the earlier Roman version.
It's quite fascinating, all right. And it's even more interesting that we can see that kind of evolution going on as well. I notice on top as well that you're keeping yourself nice and warm for the old Irish winters. And even, I suppose that would be
Yeah.
handy for campaigning as well as a nice little overhead in your sleeping bag and stuff. So you've got the nice little Irish cloak on. And I notice on top of that as well, you've got a nice
Yes.
little brooch.
Yes, this is actually only one variation of brooches as well. The Irish actually showed off their wealth mostly, especially by the time of the Viking Age, started to show their wealth by using their brooches. This, though, is just a common brooch compared to a more beautifully decorated brooch that has sometimes even jewels and such on it, like this one does. This one, though, is a lot more meant for the more wealthier noblemen compared to this, which is a lot more easier, but they still had beautiful design work on there that showed off. But that's how they preferred. But yes, I could also use the said cloak as a pretty much as well, one as a blanket, especially if you're over on the seas, you could just use it all over yourself to cover yourself from the harsh winds and such. And but there are accounts of even some warriors wearing cloaks on the battlefield, but a lot of times I even read accounts of them even having themselves getting caught in a net because apparently somebody grabs them by the cloak, pulls them down, and finishes them off. Other accounts state that they unbuckle the cloak from themselves. There is many accounts on how this looks, but I can guarantee you it was probably not a good idea to always wear a cloak on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And by later centuries, the Irish thought, yeah, we're not going to wear these on the battlefield anymore. This is getting ridiculous.
Yeah, I've worn a cloak a few times, trying to show off, and for me personally, it's actually the pin. It's the pin jumping around, stabbing everything around me, especially myself. Even when I've gone drinking with the lads and stuff back home in Ireland for various early medieval festivals, and the pin. Once we have had a few drinks, we're all there trying to hug and all that kind of stuff, and the pin just stabbing and poking anyone who comes close to me is absolutely hilarious. On top of that as well, I notice you've got a very different sword to what we see later on in the Viking Age. Could you tell me about that?
Yes, this is actually of the mid-era style sword of what the Irish could have used. This, though, was probably copied from the British Isle or the Britannia or uh, Strathclyde, whatever kingdom of the Britons you want to call, such as the Welsh and such. This, though, is a wooden design version. The would have had a like if you were more of a noble class, like a little more wealthier, you could afford one that has a metal for the pommel and guard, rather than this one, which is wood, which means it's a tip-heavy sword, and this is meant for good cutting style warfare, especially for cavalry. However, this one is a little bit longer. Now, majority of what we can understand is that the majority of these swords were about 20 to 25 inches. This is about 29 inches in length, and which meant it's a good cutting weapon. Now, though, this is of the mid era of what they would have pretty much used, by of which we can understand majority though that this type of sword probably was used by the Irish on the eastern coast of Ireland, while those in say more inland or more of Western Ireland could have probably still used the uh, well, earlier Irish type weaponry, such as we see from the Latin style culture, but these would have been made out of wood, not like this, but and have been more shorter, like this type of size, like this one. But nonetheless, are a good indication on. But by the later centuries of the Golden Age of Ireland, most of those swords would have been replaced. The hilts would have looked a lot more different. They would have looked like this model here. But that's pretty much stating the least of what they would during coast of Ireland. They had more raiding into those regions, so they would have adopted more of that type of equipment. For example, here is another example of one of these type of swords, and this is based more onto the Roman variation. And this type of one was actually also found in Dalriada, or the western coast of Scotland, near Iona, I believe it was. Although I might have gotten it wrong, it might have been near Donad, because from what we can understand, it was found with ringlets of gold, and so this would have been a nobleman's sword, maybe taken from battle and such, and later evolved. Though, from what we can understand, the fuller though on this one is a little different compared to how it would have really looked like, because what the Irish mostly had with their swords were apparently with a fuller like this one, which is a lot more wider compared to this one. But still, it did actually match the same type of charismatic type of design of how they would have fought. This one, though, a lot lighter, a lot more effective. Because, one, this grip is not exactly 100% to my liking compared to this one. But, as I said, it depended on where they were, because from the scholar, especially during the time of Columcille, scholars even wrote that one can tell an Irishman from his region just by looking at his equipment he wore or his sword. And this indicates on where they raided, especially. Because, one, if you were in the western coasts of Ireland, you would have been probably used the older design. But if you had been on the eastern coast, you would have had a different design compared to where you were. For example, those of the Kingdom of Dalriada probably used swords near identical to Pictish swords like this. Now, this is a Pictish style sword. Still, it could have later incorporated into its own design. In fact, we do have accounts of Irish in the Kingdom of Dalriada having shorter swords compared to that of the Irish that lived further south, such as in Munster and such, who used longer swords. In fact, some noblemen even had jeweled swords like this one. Now, this is based off of a Sutton Hoo sword, but there are accounts that even stated of jeweled pommels on top, which, when I think of jeweled swords, I just think that sounds identical to the Sutton Hoo swords, and some of them even had ivory handles. This one doesn't, sadly, so. But it's still beautiful to think about of what that could have looked like.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating that they are adapting to the warfare of the region that they're raiding into. So that, as you said there, that you have the Dalriada who are going into the modern day Scotland, the Pictish areas, and raiding and looting and attacking the Picts. But at the same time, down the southern areas, more my area, of Munster and Leinster, that you have the men of those areas who are going into Wales and into the Anglo-Saxon territories of modern day England, and they're adapting to the warfare that's happening in there because as we read the likes of Tristan and Iseult and stuff, there's a good profit in the slave trade that's happening in that area. And obviously, as you were saying before, the loot that they were bringing back, and with that they were adapting to the warfare of that area. So it is interesting that not only do we have cattle raiding happening in the island, which is affecting the equipment of the retinue and also the kerns that live out in the wilderness, but also the fact that it's getting affected by the raiding and conventional warfare that's happening in Britain, that the Irish are adapting to that. That's absolutely fascinating and very, very interesting. Also, on top of that as well, I noticed you had a few spears. So my main impression is always the fact that the sword was a secondary weapon, the main weapon was the spear. Is that the same during the period of the Golden Age of Ireland?
That is actually true. However, the spear would be first, then would be a club or axe-like weapon. Now, we'll get to those very soon, but then there would be the sword. However, now, this one I do have to explain, though, which I have read, is that they would have used, from what I've read, some accounts state that they use javelins. Other accounts state, I hear, of darts being thrown. Now, this is my best incorporation of a dart being a Roman pumbata, but from what we can understand is that they threw darts, or some accounts they say, because these are written by the monks who try to put a theatrical term into it. Now, when I hear dart, I automatically think of an atlatl, of which there have been accounts of the Irish using an atlatl, because one atlatl has been all throughout, everywhere throughout, not just Europe, but as well all across the world, all across every continent that human beings have been on. The only thing is we don't have, because this is only my best belief, is that it might have been an atlatl that threw darts. However, though, probably over time they probably switched to javelins, as it would be like, well, why don't we just put a rope around the javelin and make it a lot easier? And that would have been my best bet to what they would later evolve to. But yes, the javelin would have been short, small, and as well, there are accounts that even cavaliers that were riding past their opponents, they wouldn't use a big, long spear like this unless it came to defending themselves. But when it came to them charging around, because what they would do is that they would charge, like just ride around, pull from a bag that had their javelins, and just chuck it at their opponents, which is the most horrifying thing you can think about. Because just imagine riding around your opponent and just laughing at them and hurling a enemy's head that you took them from battle previously and throwing it at them.
Yeah.
And then throwing a javelin towards them. That would be horrifying, just seeing that happen to you. Now, the javelin bag that they were said to have used apparently could contain somewhere between 10 or 20 javelins. This is, from what we can understand, during the Battle of the Books, for example, that was caused by Colm Keil, who, best example of it is that this battle was caused mainly due to, I guess the best way I could put it is copyright claim.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can think about it.
Yeah, it's very comical because a lot of people talk about the genocide of the pagans and stuff. And what happened here is that officially Ireland wasn't Christianized yet, and yet there were two Christian men fighting over the copyright of, I'm sure it was the Bible. They were fighting over the copyright of the Bible amongst themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah, and what happened is that the levies that were raised up were all pagan levies. So you literally had pagans committing, because this turned into one of the most bloodiest battles in Irish history, called the Battle of the Buck. And it was all caused by two Christians who escalated the situation of the Northern Inal and Southern Inal. This is where we start to see the branching off of both groups. And it was all caused by two Christians. So two pagan groups and two pagan kings ended up branching away into Northern Inal and Southern Inal because of two Christians. And so everyone always kind of glorifies that the Christians had gone in there and genocide as many pagans as possible. Well, if you want to consider them tricking them into genociding, maybe you could argue that. But it's actually much more comical than you realize, is the fact that they committed genocide because they were fighting for someone else's copyright claim. It's absolutely hilarious and really shows why you should definitely delve into Irish medieval history for sure. It's also interesting as well because you brought up the Hobbler horse, the horse that's specifically adapted to the very rough terrain of Ireland. And you're right, the Hobbler horse moving through the rough terrain very uniquely is definitely something that the Anglo-Saxons and the Welsh probably, I'm not so much sure about the Welsh. Maybe they did have Hobbler horses, but from my understanding, I haven't come across any records of the Welsh having Hobbler horses or the Anglo-Saxons. So when the Irish raiders are appearing off their boats and flying around with their javelins and stuff, if they did bring their Hobbler horses with them, it would have been a terrifying sight for sure.
However, from some accounts I have read from Saxon monks, they do state on the Welsh or Strathclyde or Britons or Romans as some, because the Welsh kingdoms or Britannic kingdoms are still known as Romans still by this point, because they still view themselves as Roman. It's only by one point in time they start to stop calling themselves Romans. So I'm just going to call them Romans, so that way we can understand. I'm not going to call each kingdom what it is. But they state that these Romans are short, stubby horses that rode to and from, and they called them light cavaliers. Now, the Saxons, on the other hand, they didn't use cavalry at all, which anybody out there that just watches movies or series and whatever, and you say, oh, look, the Saxons, they're riding on horses. That means they used them. Nope, that did not happen. Otherwise, they would have used them at the Battle of Hastings. And yeah,
that's because very true.
Because this indicates a lot of how this goes. Saxons are more, well, like that of how the Vikings would have fought, while the Irish and Picts and even Romans, they were more had their own way of warfare comparing to how they could have fought. In fact, most historians believe that the Irish and the Picts learned from the Romans and designed their own style of cavalry style warfare based off of them before slowly fading out from its own existence, because it's a little different. But the Hobbler horse would have probably been used in those regions for quite some time. But however, though, the spear, now this, though, is just a regular hand spear. It's a one-handed spear. This, though, could have also been used as a lance on cavalry, but could have probably still just been an everyday spearman could just use this and such behind his shield. Now this one is a spear tip that's more meant for thrusting capabilities. Oops. But yeah, as I said, it could have been more meant for thrusting capability, but there are some of them that I have read that could even be used for cutting capability or nictar. And there is one account that I don't know if I got this name wrong, but his name is Tartarum, who of which used such a lance-like weapon to kill his half-brother, who was also trying to be the High King of Ireland. So it was a war between two High Kings during the Golden Age of Ireland. And it's stated that he used this blade to quickly kill his brother when he swatted at him, nicking him through his nose and into his eyeball. So just imagine how horrifying that would have been, just seeing that, especially with your eyeball just dangling loose, and you're still seeing what is the horrifying scenario of your half brother just finishing you off by cutting at you. We can also see this from Tale of Cuchulainn, for example, especially with the Diabolicum, which is a special fear-throwing type of warfare. And what we can understand from accounts, the Irish might have learned a lot from the Picts, especially with the school of learning off the Isle of Skye, I believe it was, that we can understand that, hey, let's learn from these guys on how to fight and such. So they might have learned to and from over the centuries. The spear, though, was the primary first weapon out of every weapon. Other weapons, like a club-like weapon like this, would have also been used. Now, these were very dangerous weapons. Now people think, oh, but what's a club going to do? It's like, you want to get whacked in the head with this thing? I really don't want to get whacked. Because even if you're wearing a helmet, you could still feel the club bludgeoning into you, especially because during the raids on Ireland, many Irish warriors that did use these rather than use their swords, in which during the time of I want to say the High King during the time, I just can't remember his name, but he ordered the Irish to use only wooden clubs, so that way the moonlight doesn't glint off of their weaponry, especially when they creep up to the Viking raiders and bash in their skulls in the middle of the night. Especially one, because from written accounts stated that even a Viking that was on guard, he was wearing his helmet, but he felt a blow through his helmet and into the back of his skull, which killed him in the process. So don't knock the wood. It's like, may be light and easy to make, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad weapon. In fact, we even have accounts even as far back to even the Romans during the battle of the ambush at the Teutoburg Forest. They write on how the Germans used wooden clubs that bashed through their plate armor, such as their lorica cimentarta, and as well even their helmets, and they felt the blow and it killed them in the process, or even broke bones. Because in fact, there are so many accounts that even as far even into the 16th century that we started to see more and more of these weapons. And in fact, you can actually say that this is like an Irish version of the mace, if you would, only without the metal head.
I was thinking that. Like, I didn't realize such a simple weapon could be so dominant in the battlefield. And now that you bring up, especially with your example to Viking helmets, yeah, it does seem to be the Irish version of a mace, which is very interesting and really shows that the Irish are adapting to the warfare at the time, especially adapting to helmets. The fact that they're willing to deal with helmets by using a big shtick, as a mace to smash in the helmet and stuff. It's quite fascinating that we do have that adaptation to warfare going on. And it does goes to show that the helmet must have been at a certain level common in Ireland. The fact that they're using those weapons as a mace at the time.
But yes, we get many accounts written of that both the higher up noblemen and even as lower class levy troops using this more than the sword to kill their opponent. While apparently those of the levy troops only used, like if they couldn't get a hold of a sword, they would go for the next best deal and use an axe. Now, most of the time, though, these would have been utility axes. These would not a one-handed utility axe. This would not be the infamous two-handed axe. Now, I got that, but I'm not going to show that here because, one, we don't have record of them using that until the Viking Age, of which says the least. So, in other words, they would have used something like a one-handed style everyday tool, not like this one, but more like, yeah, that's about it. Now, it would have had different shaft lengths depending on what had been used, such as for farming, hatchet and such. But still, this is a dangerous weapon. And if a foot soldier could not afford a sword, this would be his next bet to get. And this would still be horrifying. Now, why would this be horrifying? Many people say, no, I hear many of the viewers saying, oh, wait, that's just a little axe. It's not going to do that much damage. You really want to find out how dangerous this is?
Oh,
This, because literally the smaller that blade length is, the more punching power it will. Because there are accounts that say that even through the thickest of mail shirts, one could feel the blow even into the body. And it doesn't matter if you're wearing armor, you will feel this through your armor. In fact, now I had to remind people that gambesons are technically not being worn by this point, but we do have accounts of woven tunics that were tightly woven, but still, the blow of an axe like this could still be felt through it. So, I don't want to take my chances going up against a guy using this.
You said that I found it very interesting that you said there that the Irish so the Irish were between around 410 to 550 they were wearing gambeson, but they seem to have gone, there seems to be a period between 550 to 793 before the arrival of the Vikings where they're using less gambeson, and then obviously when the Vikings arrive in 793 they go back to more conventional fighting on the island, so they start to use gambeson again. I'm assuming that's what you're saying, especially since there's cattle raiding and more raiding going on, especially in Britain. So you're implying that there's less gambesons used.
And they actually wore what I'm wearing right now, which is woven tunics, which these are tightly woven wool. It would have been doubled layer as such. The thing is that we don't have account of it being called gambeson, as because when we go into the high medieval age, especially during the Viking Age, we have written accounts on the iron, both woven tunics and padded jackets, especially during the time of Brian Boru, during the Battle of Clontarf. It deeply describes on the battle, especially on the well, I remember the book. It was called the Tale of Brian Boru, I believe it was called, or the Lost Tale of Brian Boru. I can't remember which one it was since there's so many books on it, but the one I've read apparently states that there were both tunics, which were apparently double layered of tightened wool tunics, and padded jackets, or in this case, doublets, or some sort of coat. And it gives both accounts of what the Irish could have worn. So, in other words, it's like saying, which gives a good description stating that, hey, the Vikings are kicking our butts. Why don't we start using their equipment? Because apparently, this armor that was Irish, like it was apparently an armor doublet, if you would, that apparently was designed. The earliest account of what I've read actually goes back as far as the 1st century BC, used by the Gauls. And the Romans, when they invaded Britain, they also described the Britons also using a certain type of armor just like it. The thing is, over time, though, it starts to fade out in those regions from where the Romans conquered, mainly because, one, Britons, they didn't have that style arms and armor like that of the people of Gaul did, but when places like Ireland and Pitland, or Caledonia, whatever you want to pronounce it as, they kind of stayed out of the Roman influence sphere, and over the centuries, it's like saying, like, hey, we had this type of equipment, why don't we just put this mail over our equipment? And sure enough, it worked, apparently. Now, though, these woven tunics, from what we can understand, there are many names from them from what they were originally called, such as jerkins or sleeveless plate or tunic. Because one wouldn't just wear a tunic over another tunic for no reason. There has to be a reason that they wore that. But it's unknown of how many layers, because today we still don't have. We have written accounts, but we have no archaeological findings on what this could have looked like, since one, material in Ireland does degrade over a certain amount of time, and you do have to have a certain amount of time to get that equipment out.
Yeah, yeah. Depressingly enough, I was saying that to someone the other day about why crannogs are so important to us because of the way the boggy land is around the crannog. It actually keeps so much information alive, clothing and stuff, compared to a regular farmstead ring fort of that period, where the archaeological find around that area is gone. It's completely missing, like because the ground being so acidic. So yeah, hopefully we find something in those cranogs, because that would be absolutely amazing. I seen you have another secondary weapon around your belt, some kind of knife or something, is it?
This, yes, it's an everyday tool type weapon. The knife would have been commonly used. Now, some of these even had a rounded pommel up on here, though it depended on whether or not if you were apparently Christian enough. Because apparently, in a lot of these rounded pommels, they had the symbol of Christ. But those that were apparently what many historians believe were pagan did not have these. So kind of hard to understand whether or not this event, but my best belief, it's like, well, that might be true, or maybe the guy was too poor to actually buy something like that, because this would be an everyday tool. You could use this one for shaving. You can use this for, especially if you're on a ship, you can use this for the rigging and such.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of accounts of them wearing that, especially real close. However, one thing I have also uh, read from historical accounts, let me get the shield out, is that when shield formations were pressed up against each other like so that it was hard to get your sword out and swing, what you would do is grab your knife and do it right over, or even worse, into the unprotected manberries.
Yeah, lovely. Because I've also come across. Have you come across accounts then of? Because I noticed the Saxons have much more longer knives and stuff called the Saxon. Did you have any accounts of that one?
We actually do have accounts of the CX, like this model.
Mm.
This was a longer model what they could have used, but this, but from what we can understand, is that when the Saxons, when they fought, they mostly used it in the front end, like most knives. However, this one is very long. Most of these, though, would have been like that long, but still, it is a gruesome weapon, to say the least. And from what we can understand, especially if you're, as I said, like say in the shield formations, where did I put the shield? Oh, when it comes to the formations, you're pressed up against each other. So a long sax weapon like this would not work for the battlefield. You need something smaller, especially for getting over. And even during the Viking Age, we also have accounts of that, of when the Vikings actually came. The shields are pressed up against each other, and some accounts even state that Vikings pull out their small saxes, which are like this, a everyday utility knife. People think, it's a utility knife, it's not going to do that much damage. It's like, get up close to somebody, and this thing will be pretty good at doing its job, better than this. Because which would you take for a close quarters combat fight? Something that you can easily use, or something that is overworldly, stupidly big, and which you can't get at improperly enough, especially because with this, it feels more as a swinging weapon compared to this, which is its getting close weapon. But yeah, this is like this ridiculous weapon, if you ask me, compared to a smaller weapon you can use every day.
God, that's absolutely fascinating. And it really goes to show how both sides are adapting to the warfare, especially during a battle when you have that complete failed spear wall and they're clashing against each other. Because remembering it's meant to function as a bunch of spears that are cleansing everything in front of them. If they clash against each other, it's kind of failed. But the fact that they're, just like the Landscanet much later on, adapting to the warfare that's in front of them, that they're taking out their secondary weapon and straight away stabbing what's in front of them, really shows the level of depth that's going on in the warfare at the time. I notice as well that you have a belt. Is that in case you get lost in sea again? Compared to our last video where we discussed something like that, is that once again very similar to the late medieval belt?
That is actually correct. These woven style belts would start to be used, especially during the Golden Age of Ireland. Though we do have a couple of accounts before that of the Golden Age of Ireland, but they're very not so good at indicating as a there was only a single coloration compared to this, which shows multiple colors. As you can see, there's red, white, and blue, indicating of my family and such, of where they are from and such. So in doing so, it's like, hey, I got lost at sea, or I was taken captive in battle. So it's like, can you ransom me back to my family? And it's like, oh yeah, sure, here we go.
Yeah, yeah, that does absolutely make perfect sense because you can see the original reason for them, which is, in case a fisherman is lost at sea. But it makes perfect sense, especially for what you were saying there, in case you need to be ransomed back to your own family. Especially within Ireland itself, when it's just a bit of banter, one warband takes you one weekend, another warband takes you another. It's just the way warfare is in Ireland. And obviously, then the more serious your cases, if you get taken in Britain and have to be ransomed back from slavery of some sort, yeah, the belt would come in handy, all right. Other than that, I noticed as well that you have the quarter length pants, which is very fitting to what we see in the Book of Kells and also in Geraldine's description as well of both the kerns and also the retinue in Ireland as well. Could you explain and go into more depth about that?
Yes. When we understand, like, people end up thinking, oh, yeah, the pants, they were supposed to be long and such. No, not on the battlefield, especially in Ireland. That is actually ludicrous to believe about. Now, only a couple, because it's in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, or Pitland, that we actually have accounts of them using shorter pants, especially because, one, the terrain and the weather involved. Especially if you go raiding across the sea, it's like, should I use long pants that will get me incredibly soaked, or short pants that will actually do the job? I'm gonna take the shorties. It's
Yeah, I fully agree with you, especially because myself and Rambling Kern have done martial arts on the muddy terrain that's in Ireland. It's insanely slippery. And remember, the rubber soles that Irish people wear today in the 20th century literally only appear around 1920. So that's where finally we started getting enough grip to actually wear shoes in Ireland. Because for a very long time, people assumed we were just poor. Oh God, look at you, you're very, very poor. And it's like, no, the ground is just so slippery. You can wear shoes and stuff inside of settlements like Waterford, Dublin, Cork. But if you're out way out in the countryside and it's constantly raining, it's constantly boggy, it's constantly slippery, no sure Bob, I'd rather go barefoot to be quite honest with you and stop falling into the mud, especially when doing martial arts, because the foot naturally can grip the soft ground. So it's much more easier to run around and do martial arts, especially if you're used to that terrain on your feet. So yeah, 100% agree with you that quarter length pants was definitely used within the early medieval period, especially during that golden age. And we have continuous depictions. Anytime they're drawing the kern, for example, you see the kern straight away, quarter length pants. I'm not quite sure about the retinue. I don't know too much depictions of the king's warband, his retinue, having quarter length pants on or off, but the fact that Flan Shinna and a few other Gael warriors and stuff in later accounts during the Viking Age have quarter length pants on, I think it's a good indication that the retinue, the King's Warband, would have definitely had quarter length pants on. So I think it's universal at the time, to be quite honest with you, if warriors were wearing quarter length pants. And it makes sense to me that they were wearing quarter length pants. I know a few people will be watching this thinking that but surely they would have worn a kilt. No, unless you're talking about a really long tunic. No, I would have to say that it's definitely the quarter length pants. Ability. I'd have to look at depictions of monks. I think monks have proper pants on, and perhaps it's just the warriors who are on the quarter length pants. Because you can understand quarter length pants, especially for fighting in Ireland. So I definitely would have to look at to see what monks are wearing, to be quite honest with you, especially when you have that movement, like when it comes down to, there's movement of raiding and fighting and stuff between Britain and Ireland. And I know this is going slightly out of your field of expertise, because your field of expertise is warfare. But if we look at the clothing that's depicted in more of the literature side of things, we may see more pants being worn by the Irish monks and stuff going between Britain and Ireland, and perhaps the movement of fashion, especially between Charlemagne's court and Ireland, could have brought in more stuff. But I think that's more going into Colin's field of expertise, and I would love to bring Colin back onto the channel later on and discuss especially the influences between Charlemagne's court into Ireland when all that stuff kicks off. That'd be a very, very interesting conversation to have. But other than that, Connor, thank you so much for coming on to the channel today. It was great to discuss about warfare in Ireland during the period of 550 all the way up to 793, to talk about and discuss the much more heavier retinue of the King's Warband. And I think your outfit is absolutely magnificent, to be quite honest with you. If I was to talk about the King's Warband, his retinue, I would definitely turn around and say Connor's got that kit completely squared away. And of course, if we were then switch around to talk about the way lighter infantry, which were the Kerns, the elite cattle raiders, who would have just ran around in quarter-length pants, as we can see in both the Book of Kells and in Gerald of Wales's depictions. It wouldn't take much for you to strip down to quarter-length pants and then go off and do your old cattle raiding, especially in this time of year now, from May at the start of Baltana all the way over to November in Samhain, when we have cattle raiding season going on for the joy of it. So Connor, I want to thank you so much for coming onto the channel again today and doing this with me.
No problem. But before we end this, I think we also need to talk about the tunic colorations as well, because most people don't get this one, which I am kind of sad to say the least. But when we understand on the levy units and such, and Kern units, they would have mostly worn, apparently from what I've read, especially if we read from the book here of Arthur and the Anglo-Saxon Wars, it describes that Kerns and levy units would have worn black and yellow tunics, and which I had actually done a video on that a while back, covering the Kerns of that era, in which this is the tunic I wore for that entire video. Now, for the warrior retinue like myself, we would have worn apparently a mix of brown, gray, or even red, and sometimes accounts of green. However, the more noble class wore blue and purple. Mostly, when I believe it from this form, blue, I would actually see it as a form of the noble, everyday nobleman, but purple, probably the form of the high kings of Ireland. In which, if we take a look at further historical accounts, Brian Boru also tried to make himself, well, being known as the Emperor of the Gaels, might have actually worn purple.
Yeah, I do fully agree with you, especially if you're arguing that he was wearing scale armor on the day of the Battle of Clontarf. It would make sense that he was wearing purple, especially from the trade link we can see, because Brian Boru, he got his education in Kerry, so Kerry was definitely under the influence of the Dalcash at the time, and Kerry then has a trade network going all the way over to the Byzantine Empire. We can actually find slabs around the Kerry area where we can see Byzantine crosses, which highlight the fact that there was trading going on. And a lot of people depict the crosses as Irish people who'd seen Byzantine crosses had come back and wanted to tell their friend, hey look, I seen this cross, and literally draws it into the stone carvings to show people that's what these magic crosses from across the sea all the way in modern day Turkey, called the Byzantine Empire at the time, which was Christianized at the time. This is what I seen over there. It was absolutely magnificent. We need to start making this kind of stuff in Ireland. So it makes sense that that kind of trade route, if they're trading purple into the island of Ireland, that would be worn by the likes of the Nail, especially Deirdre MacCurbal, when he becomes over king of the Irish during the period when they're switching from paganism to Christianity. And then we're going into the spark that is the golden age of Ireland. But other than that, Connor, thank you so much for coming onto the channel today. It means so much to myself and all my followers, and we're huge fans of your content. And of course, if you're new to the sphere of Irish medieval history, definitely subscribe to myself and definitely head over to Connor's channel, the Celtic Templar. Just easily swift down, either type into Google Celtic Templar or head on to my channel and just zoom down to the very bottom where you can easily find Connor's channel. But Connor, thank you so much for coming on today. And other than that, guys, thank you so much, and slán go bhaile.